Well, hello everybody and welcome back to the All Saints podcast. I'm here with my good friend, your deacon, Nate Douglas. Nate, thanks for joining us.
Thanks again for having me, Steve.
And this podcast was trailed in a sermon a couple of weeks ago that I preached. We were talking about 2 Timothy chapter 4, verses 6 to 8, in connection with the danger of fighting the fight in the wrong place, of being distracted from priorities that are really, really meaningful, really significant, onto things that don't matter so much. I said, one of our deacons even emailed me to say, hey, we should do a podcast on voting. And I jokingly emailed back, there's an election.
Right.
And I think I said in that sermon words to the effect of, okay, look, obviously this is a significant issue. You've got a presidential election coming up, a bunch of other elections scattered around it.
Yeah, or is it significant?
Yeah. But it's a question of, like, how do we navigate this event? How do we think wisely about it as Christians? Obviously, it's a massively significant moment in this nation's history. Every 4 years, there is a sense in which this sets the agenda politically. It doesn't need to be said. But at the same time, we want to recognize that there are some ways in which people think about this event that get things wrong. It's understandable that people... sometimes driven by frustration, sometimes political discussions, even among people who normally agree on lots of things, people might disagree about tactics or longer-term strategy and how this matters in relation to other things. And it even raises kind of other pastoral questions like, is it okay not to vote? And what about when husbands and wives disagree? And what about where friends disagree about the course of action to take? And I just want to jump straight headlong into this with the caveat, and I jokingly said this in the sermon, like, you've got to promise not to listen to this. And the point of that was, let's try and weight the significance of this issue appropriately in relation to other things. So don't not listen to it, okay? But maybe one of the things we'll get to in a few minutes will be, okay, how and why does this matter and in what ways? So that we can recognize simultaneously that it is a big deal and other things are a big deal too.
Certainly. I mean, it's unfortunate that probably when we release this episode and the title is put in it, elections or voting or whatever is placed there, that it's probably going to generate more views than how to be a good father, an episode on that. Unfortunately, that's just the nature of the beast. And we don't want to feed that, which is what your comment was directed about.
Well, let's jump in there, right? And just think, okay, how important is this? How big a deal is it? And how does it compare to other things? And in the context of when I was preaching, I was talking about fight the good fight. If you look at how Paul uses that expression elsewhere in his writings, the vast majority of occurrences are not to do with dealing with external hostility and persecution, though that is there, right? Not pretend it's not Philippians 1 and so on. It's actually to do with the life of faith, faithfulness in our relationships, and ungodly desires, fighting against ungodly discontent, and so on and so forth. And like before we get to how and why politics matters, let's just acknowledge, like, most people listening to this podcast come to All Saints Church. We live in Texas. Your vote here probably doesn't make much difference. And even if you're in one of those kind of swing counties in the swing states in Arizona or Pennsylvania or wherever it is, your vote still doesn't make that much difference, even if it got really far down to the wire. I think one of the things that is under the surface a lot of the time in people's frustration about politics is the sense that we can't do anything about it. The answers seem obvious to us. And it's like this massive asteroid hurtling towards us, and it looks like there's a 50% chance it's going to wipe us all out. Mm-hmm. And we feel powerless about it. And I wonder how much of our emotional reaction to the political choices that lie before us arises from the fact that we just feel frustrated at our powerlessness to effect a kind of change that seems obvious to us would be a good idea.
Right. Yeah, that's why I kind of asked at the beginning when you were talking about the significance of this upcoming election, like, or is it? Well, I mean, certainly is for the external reasons that you were talking about, but in the life of the Christian, and then as it affects our church, for example, this is probably not quite as significant as, for example, having husbands that are not taking care of their wives, or children that are not being raised in the nurture of admonition of the Lord properly.
Right.
Those things are much more significant and bear much more weight. And at the end of the day, that's what we're called to do. Just like your sermon on fighting the good fight, that was Paul's focus. It wasn't on the external factors. It's not like he had a bastion of amazing rulers as his peers.
There he is in prison in Rome. Yeah,
right. But he's not complaining about that per se, or saying fight the rulers in Rome. His weapons were a different sort, and his focus lied elsewhere, and so should ours.
And I think we can say that and simultaneously recognize a couple of other things. Like there's a timescale point here, right? Even if it's the case that politics is downstream from culture and culture is downstream from the religious life of a nation in the broadest terms.
Sure.
Even if that's true, it is the case that politics impacts our nation. And we've actually seen that in the last 8 years.
Right.
Like we've seen in the bizarrest possible way the repeal of Roe. And if you just think, if you go back 20-something years and you talk to all the churches and all the people who are campaigning in different ways for pro-life kind of issues, and even when you say that, we realize there are people who take very different views about how to go about that kind of pro-life stance.
Right.
But if you said, like, what's going to happen is a former showbiz entrepreneur who has publicly boasted about sexually abusing women is going to take the highest executive office in the land and appoint Supreme Court justices who are going to repeal Roe v. Wade. Right. People would have said you're absolutely out of your mind. If you said that in 2000, people would have thought you were stir crazy. And the simple truth is, we so routinely misjudge how the Lord is going to change the world, and then retrospectively we narrate it as though it makes sense, and we sort of knew what he was doing all along.
Right.
Like you just would not have done it this way if you'd been planning anything. And the Lord's ways are not our ways. And it's a lesson that's very hard to take to heart, because we have this kind of post hoc or retrospective bias where we make sense of events afterwards that we never would have predicted beforehand.
Right.
And we forget when we're looking into the future that we have no idea what the Lord is going to do.
Right. That still needs to be in tandem with the cultural elements too. So Roe has passed, and we've had some runway and a kind of a big data set since it's passed. Abortions have not gone down across the country. Some states are reporting abortions actually going up after Roe. If you talk to our local pregnancy help center and their director, they are seeing more mothers coming in post-Roe than pre-Roe that need help. There are fathers that are still not taking their fatherly responsibilities. So all of these cultural elements, while we may have scored what we think is a political victory over here through the amazing means that only God could have accomplished, there's still a lot of more significant work that needs to be done as far as winning hearts to the Lord.
Yeah. I wonder as well if we can think about it in terms of the kind of outcomes that are possible. I mean, I think the upsides and downsides tend not to be evenly distributed. Okay, so I can think of. I'll give you a couple of examples. I remember having a conversation with one lady a number of years ago who's very frustrated with, as it happens, the Republican administration, and we had this conversation shortly after, probably 6 or 8 months after President Biden took office. But she was very frustrated with the kind of previous administration. And finally, she was sort of breathing this sigh of relief about an administration she thought was more amenable to her own political views. And I asked her, so what difference did this make to your life? What changes it made? And she couldn't name a single thing.
Yep.
On the other hand, there are people who will lose their jobs, or maybe get jobs,
right,
because of the outcome of the election, right? So there are the negative and positive implications are not evenly distributed. I think of other friends of mine who are somewhat older,
Right.
whose healthcare costs spiraled just out of control because of some of the implications of some legislation from a previous administration. And I'm talking kind of hedgy terms here, right? Because we're a 501c3. We don't exist to give political advice or offer party political critique.
Yes.
So while being a church, you're not going to hear you're not going to hear party political points. I hope you'll hear points of Christian public theological principle, like abortion, for example.
Sure.
You might hear us talking about dumb welfare policies and other things where Scripture speaks to those things, but we'll try and steer clear of the kind of the obvious, transparent party political issues. But
and it cuts both ways, though, too. I mean, you can pick any one of those issues where it would affect some people negatively over here. If one person was elected versus the other, you could pick an equally impactful issue of another kind if another person was elected. There are some things that are not unique to one or the other.
Exactly. And there's, I guess, part of me thinks you've got this multi-dimensional matrix of different ways of analyzing, like, the significance of politics. It's significant in the sense that we personally get to shape much about it,
right?
Practically zero. Significance in the sense of how it affects the country as a whole. Yeah, there is an impact, and it's a long-term, mostly, like moving the center of gravity of a nation in a particular direction. And then there is, how is the impact distributed over different people? And for some people, it's a very long-term impact, and there's no short-term downside in terms of their own personal circumstances, though there might be in terms of outcomes they care about, like for the unborn. But for other people, it is like, boom, my insurance costs just doubled. Or we now have a Fed governor who is a fiscal dove, and interest rates are now unaffordable because I can't afford to buy a house. You know, there are massively significant impacts on people's lives, and I think it's worth recognizing that. Now, what that then does, if this is more like an asteroid hurtling towards Earth and we can't really affect the outcome, but the outcome might be significant for us. One question to ask yourself is: look, if you genuinely feared heading towards some kind of dystopian economic outcome in the medium term, let's say 10, 15 years, if you thought it was a reasonable possibility that the politics of America might be headed in the direction of the politics of Western Europe, what would you do to secure your family's well-being? You might just think, I have a moral responsibility to the degree that I can to try and make sure that my family is financially safeguarded.
Sure.
Right? If I think healthcare costs are going to spiral, and I am married and want to have children and want to make sure that my wife and my kids are looked after, I might not be able to rely on the kind of economic prosperity that might come from economic freedom in the long term. And so does a moral responsibility devolve upon you to figure out how to increase your income? Or does a moral responsibility devolve upon you to figure out how to support those in your midst who are being harmed by policies which you regard as destructive? And it strikes me that as a church and as individual families, those closer to home questions, they're less like an asteroid hurtling towards us. They're more like a river overflowing its banks, and we've got a chance to go and snatch somebody out of the raging waters. Like, you could go and help, or you could get yourself out of trouble. And I don't hear so many people talking about that, and I suspect it's because, in truth, Nate, criticizing the stuff out there is more comfortable than recognizing, there may be bad stuff going on out there. I need to take action to try and safeguard those I love from it. What can I do? What could I do to protect my own family or to safeguard my own family a little bit more? That's just a harder question to answer, right?
It is. And there's not much business in that either. There's obviously a lot of business in being able to talk about and fighting the external factors and and get people worked up and then get them coming back for more.
Yeah.
It's a lot harder to do what you're proposing.
Yeah. I mean, it just picks up some of the things you said about the Pregnancy Help Center. Actually, is an interesting example of this. One of the factors that, according to Delana Brooks, who knows more about this space than most people, right? Because she works in it.
Yes.
One of the factors that she's highlighted is the significance of being able to say to pregnant women who are considering an abortion, we will look after you. If you bring the child to full term, we will help you work through the process of submitting the child for adoption.
Right.
Now, that I don't know what that does in the heart of a young woman in that situation. I can't imagine.
Mm-hmm.
But there are costly things that you can do for one person or for one small community. And it just strikes me that, it's another way of saying the same thing. It doesn't generate the kind of viral traffic in the political commentary space to point out, you can't really affect all this stuff over here. Could you prepare yourself to be able to help yourself or your own family or others who may be harmed by outcomes that you don't desire?
Right. And that's how God has operated throughout history, right? So he's going to crush the head of the serpent, not with a battle axe, but with a young teen in Israel and a baby. His methods aren't our own, so we need to think through these things kind of with that in mind.
Yeah. So it sounds like Pastor Jeffery got Nate in here to make everybody miserable and depressed. Maybe we should sprinkle a little bit of post-mill hope in before we jump into some of the specific things. I mean, look, I think it's not just Peter Lightheart who's pointed this out, but he has done in all kinds of intriguing ways. God's path is death and resurrection. It's in his First and Second Kings commentary. Actually, I was reading it more recently. Middle of First Kings.
I was at a Trinity Reformed church when he was doing his sermon series on that, which of course books are forthcoming. Yeah.
Well, so here's what's interesting. I'm going to butcher the quotation now because I didn't look it up beforehand, but he says something like that the message of First and Second Kings is not Israel is in trouble and she needs help.
Right.
The message is Israel is dead and needs to be resurrected.
Mm-hmm.
And I was listening to a contemporary political and economic podcast just this morning, and the speaker was just pointing out what's happened to Japan's GDP in the last sort of 20, 30 years. I can't remember the dates, but it's gone from something like 17% of world GDP down to 3%.
Ugh.
And he just said, economic powers come and go.
Yes.
China's has gone from 4 to 18, and Japan has just dropped off a cliff. And if you look at the Nikkei, it's just basically, we are now where they were 30 years ago or something.
Right.
And we shouldn't kid ourselves. God's plan might be to humiliate the now post-Christian West. But if he does so, this will be like exile for Israel. And there is hope beyond exile. The message of Ezekiel is when you think you couldn't get any lower, you could.
Mm-hmm.
Death is worse than exile. But there's resurrection beyond that. And maybe we are called, like Isaiah, to live in an era when, you keep preaching until the land lies desolate, and then it's burned again, and nobody's going to pay attention to you. Then some king is going to chop you in half.
Right.
But then the land will be renewed. Comfort my people.
Yes.
Her hard service has been paid for. Proclaim the great day of the Lord's redemption. That day lies in our future. It might be that the chasm of death for the nation lies between us and that day, but that day is in the future.
Right.
And we're just called to be faithful for the next 20 seconds.
Yes.
Right. And then just rinse and repeat for the next however many years the Lord gives you.
Right.
So
yeah, that's a healthy perspective. Impatient post-millennialism doesn't do many people very good.
Yeah.
That's why we're playing the long game, and we obviously don't want kind of that scenario to play out like you were just describing.
Yeah, we'd rather have renewal than death.
Certainly, and we should still do our jobs, but it could be that that's not what God has in mind.
Right.
Having pastors like Oleg Volkov here, like we did this last week, provides an amazing perspective on all of this.
Yeah.
To think that our kind of travails and things that we have to deal with and put up with here are of some significance to the point where we should lose sleep over it, or in relationships with family members or friends. Look what he's doing, and what he has to endure every day. Every day, we still have it pretty good,
right? So, with all that in the background, that day in November is inching closer, one day at a time. By the time this podcast is released, it'll be pretty close.
Yeah,
and there'll be a certain moment when people will be thinking, well, my pastor said just be faithful for the next 20 seconds, or be faithful for the next 2 seconds.
Mm-hmm.
And the next 2 seconds, I've got to put my check mark in a box on a card.
Right.
What do I do, Pastor? Because at that point, I've got a whole bunch of questions, like neither of the options or none of the options seems morally perfect in every way.
Right.
Or do I have to vote at all? I mean, like, if I'm asked to choose between death by firing squad or death by hanging, can I just decline to participate in this ballot?
Right.
What about if I disagree with my wife or my husband, or my friend? Like, what status do the disagreements of that kind have? And there's a whole bunch of like practical questions around what we actually do, who we actually vote for, how we decide to do that.
Right.
So maybe we should just jump into that. Like, the lesser of two evils question is one that often comes up.
Right.
So let's just state a believable sketch of the current political landscape. Let's imagine that you had two candidates representing two parties, which were not, in your view, at every point morally equivalent, but both deeply flawed,
right,
both as individuals and in terms of the parties and the policies they represent.
Yeah.
Give us your thoughts, Nate, on how that. So I don't get to vote, right? I'm not an American citizen.
Right.
So at the moment, I get to vote in British elections, but not American ones.
Yes.
But for you personally, how does that land on you? Do you feel strongly inclined to say, "Well, you just pick the best of the two options," or do you think, "No, I'm not sure I have to do either of these"? Or where would you go with that?
Right. So this is, to be very clear, speaking personally. So this is just a personal opinion. I don't want to place this opinion on anyone else. One of the reasons why I thought that we should talk about this subject in general was a lot of very public opinions were being made in our not too distant circles that were very much of the conscious binding nature. And I think that's something that I wanted to hope to help our congregation navigate and kind of hopefully inoculate them against, or at least to the point where they didn't feel like they had to. So personal opinion, if you have two deeply flawed candidates, so say neither of them are pro-life and there's a myriad of other issues with both of them, you don't have to vote for one over the other. In this particular case, in the presidential one, there are third-party options and there are write-in candidates available. I see it very much as a scenario where, if you hearken back to Pastor Shaw's sermon on Genesis 14, when Abraham is caught in the middle between this conflict of 5 kings over here and 4 kings over here, do you want to ally with Kedorlaomer, or do you want to ally with the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah? Well, he said no. I feel like it's almost like a cheat code to invoke Gandalf. But in the Fellowship of the Ring, when he's telling the Council of Elrond what's happened, why he was imprisoned by Sauron, and the scenario that he was presented essentially by Sauron was, ally yourself with Sauron or align yourself with me. And Gandalf says, I'm not going to do either. And thankfully, our political system is set up in the same way, both in who we can vote for, but even when we pass legislation and laws, senators, when on the floor, if there's a law they don't like, or they're not sure, they can just say present. They don't have to say yay or nay. They can just say, I'm here and I don't like either of these options, either the status quo or the proposed alternative. So that's the stance I'm going to personally take in this instance. But people can see their votes in different ways. So we were discussing, someone could see it more as an endorsement. Another person could see a vote more as a preference. I personally don't want to align with one candidate who speaks about women the way he does, who's not pro-life, who lies about elections being stolen. And I don't think I need to talk about why the other candidate should be voted for either. But that's just a personal opinion. And so what I hope people in our congregation, that the way they look at this election, regardless of outcome and regardless of who they vote for or don't vote for, is that they're not distracted by or obsessed with the outcome, but instead reminded to focus on the things that matter, like we were talking about earlier, fighting the good fight in what God has called them to fight in, and not lose sleep over about what's coming or be anxious about what's coming.
So it's interesting. So if I can just pick up on a couple of things you said. I mean, first, the binding consciences point.
Yeah.
I think there's a huge amount of wisdom in that. And it's important to understand why that is. So the idea of binding consciences as an ethical problem arises in decisions where everyone agrees that it's at least possible that there's a right or a wrong answer.
Sure.
But it's not obvious to everybody what that answer is. And you simultaneously want to respect the fact that from God's point of view, there's a right and a wrong thing to do here.
Right.
But from our point of view, it might not be obvious what that is. And so it's not like a moral issue where we would all recognize that this is so clear. It's just not acceptable to behave in a certain way or to do a certain thing.
Right.
The idea of binding consciences arises from the recognition of human finitude and weakness and ignorance. And so what we do is we say, look, one man thinks it's okay to eat anything, and somebody else is troubled by the thought of eating certain foods that are bought in the meat market because they're associated with idol worship and they associate that with sin and they don't really want to be involved in that. Now, there's a right and a wrong answer to that question, but it's not as simple as saying, well, I get to decide what the right answer is and you guys need to fall in line.
Right.
Now, what that means in turn is that this lack of moral clarity arises from, in our case, I think it's pretty clear, failures within the respective parties. Like it would be wonderful, actually, if there was at least one party, one option that was unequivocally, at every point, a good thing. But it's not the case. I mean, just parenthetically, one of the things that always surprises me is when people take the opposite view that you've taken, and they say, no, I'm going to vote for one particular candidate. I've heard pastors say this. I'm going to vote for one particular candidate. And you all should. And you need to know he's a really principled Christian, a faithful man. I know people who've met him personally, and he's a really godly, faithful. I feel like saying, look, brother, you don't have to persuade me that he's a really godly, faithful Christian man to persuade me that it might be better to vote for him than to vote for the other side. Now, here I'm actually taking a different, or suggesting a different view from what you've espoused. And saying that voting should not be understood as unequivocal endorsement. I know you're not suggesting it is.
Right.
But voting is more an expression of preference. And because it's an expression of preference, you're able to tolerate a certain amount of dissonance between your own views and what this person stands for, because there's sufficient clear blue water between what they stand for and what the other party stands for.
Right.
And the question is, well, how much dissonance can you handle?
Yes.
Right. So and we just got to acknowledge our finitude and our inability perfectly to parse that, and therefore it's not appropriate to impose that on other people.
Right.
That said, and it's always gets more complicated than what you think about it. It's very easy to dream up bad reasons for voting in a particular direction. So somebody who voted for a particular party because they wanted to bring about some outcome or assist in the bringing about of some outcome that Scripture describes as morally evil. Well, that's not acceptable.
Right.
And I remember one of the things that really brought home to me the assumptions about, at least this was in the UK, British democracy.
Mm-hmm.
I remember a number of years ago at a general election, one of the leading newspapers in the country, it was a conservative newspaper, or as conservative as any newspaper is in England,
Mm-hmm.
put on their website this kind of calculator. And what you did was you put in where you lived and your postcode is like a zip code and your salary and whether you're married or single and how many children you had and what ages there were.
Mm-hmm.
And it would work out how much money you would save or earn in form of tax and benefits from the different parties. And the idea, the transparent motivation for this was
Right.
presumably you're going to be wanting to vote for whichever party promises to give you more of other people's money.
Right.
Here's a machine that will help you to work it out.
Oh,
and it just struck me like that is so instinctive and so reprehensible as a beginning and end of how you decide what to vote for. It's not to say that you're wrong to vote for the party that will produce the most prosperity.
Yes.
But to vote for the party that will take the most money from somebody else and give it to you,
Mm-hmm.
and that's often how it works in kind of a democratic socialist context.
Sure.
It just struck me like, well, whichever direction you voted in at that point, your motives are just self-oriented, selfish,
Right.
and ungodly.
And that's part of the problem navigating these waters is that everyone has different motives. Some people could see their votes as endorsement. Some people could see them just hold my nose and maybe I'll vote for this one that I'm somewhat preferential to.
Is there not a constitutional or at least procedural answer to that question though? About, I mean, you're the political science major, so in American law or according to American norms, voting is not seen as an endorsement, correct? I mean, party membership might be, but voting is not.
It comes down to definitions and what you mean by endorsing. Right. I haven't seen any formal kind of government or election code or anything like that that talks about that. I know people that hold some of those views personally, and I know some that don't, which again is why it gets so sticky when you have other pastors doing some of the things that we were talking about before, where claiming that voting for this person is what they would recommend, or not voting for this person means a vote for the other person. A lot of that can be quickly unhelpful for someone when it comes to the conscience binding issue.
Yeah. Well, I guess I mean just to draw some of those threads together and move on. Yeah. I'd have no problem binding somebody's conscience if I thought that there was an inescapable moral imperative.
Sure.
I just think it's
if you feel bound by Scripture to say, hey, don't do this thing, or if you do this thing, you are in sin.
Yeah, and I will say there are times. I mean, like I said, I'm not going to vote. I can't vote. Not
right
citizen. There are times. Yeah, thank you. There are times when I listen to the candidates, and especially the vice presidential candidates. Actually,
right.
I'll say this: there are times where I listen to the vice presidential candidates, and the chasm of pure competence opens so widely that I come quite close to thinking. I would struggle to understand why somebody would vote for this individual, given what else I know about this person's policies. It's not like they're trying to do really, really smart things but it's a little bit ham-fisted in how they express it.
Yeah.
But I think even at that point, if I'll say it like this, if somebody said, like, I just can't bring myself to offer what seems to me as an endorsement, even when I hold my nose, I can still smell something.
Yes.
It's like, I get that.
Right.
I get that.
And so people from their leaders need to hear that and understand that their pastor, if they are struggling with that issue, but their pastor understands that and gets that and doesn't see it as a moral imperative on them to continue through through that kind of
And I think
terrible smell and do it.
Yeah, and I think I just want to. None of this makes it easier,
No.
but I'd also want to say that an argument for moral revulsion is not a good argument.
Right.
If you got to vote for either the maintenance of the Babylonian regime or Darius the Mede, you should vote for Darius.
Yeah.
And it's not because Darius is such a great guy. It's just because you have good, divinely revealed reason to believe that in spite of this individual's morally reprehensible and idolatrous religious character and predilections, God is going to do through him, in spite of all those sins, God is going to do through him things which in the long run, though messy, will conduce to his good purposes.
And he can still do it with the Babylonians too. Say Darius the Mede does not overthrow the Babylonians. He can still do that with them too.
And it turns out that God sometimes does. And it's just like, nobody wants to see harm come to people they love. And especially when those things seem so clearly to be made, it seems that one party is going to make them more likely.
Right.
It's like, I get it.
Yeah. And that's your personal opinion. That's fine too. And it could be like you were talking about earlier, there's different levels of dissonance that someone's willing to put up with essentially. And different people's levels of dissonance could be different.
Yeah.
And at the same time, you could have a congregant that says, I've had enough. That's too much dissonance for me.
Can't cope with that.
You don't have to impute but you still need to vote for Darius.
Yeah, sure. How much of this do you think is problematic because of the lack of straight answers to simple questions? So, like, if you listen to the presidential debate,
which my children thought was hilarious.
I mean, and
they thought
it's like an exercise in question dodging,
right.
And again, this is one of the ways in which I think some of the media of the vice presidential interviews have been illuminating, because I think, I don't know, I assume people are watching this stuff. I mean, I am, and why would I do it? I have less, like I said, not going to be voting.
Do you like stabbing yourself in the eye with a fork?
Yeah, but there's when you see somebody who is making an honest attempt to actually answer the questions put to him, vice presidential candidates say, it's like, oh, okay. And when you see somebody who is simply obfuscating and refusing to answer questions which they must have known were going to be posed, it's like the obvious gotcha question to ask.
Sure.
Like, why would I throw my puny little weight behind you when you're not willing to say in public now what you think of the last 4 years or what you would do in the next 4?
Right. Or even if they answered them directly, would you be surprised if they followed through with those direct answers if they were elected? Or those direct answers could be totally different answers than they had given to that same question the week before, 2 years ago, 4 years ago.
And here's an interesting feature of the landscape. Like back in the day, Lincoln Douglas debate, back in the day, people used to have a debate constituted a reasoned discussion seeking to argue in favor of a particular policy proposal on the basis of political or ideological or even religious commitments. Right. In other words, people would have a moral argument for a particular taxation regime, or a moral argument for a particular foreign policy, or a moral argument for a particular view of the unborn. They wouldn't just simply be parroting one-liners and smears and evasions and kind of gotcha clever dodges. It's the debate has ceased to be a debate, and I think part of this difficulty with navigating the landscape of voting is that we all know that we are being treated like idiots and conned quite a lot of the time.
Oh, indeed.
And it's like, well, how are you supposed to have respect for somebody who doesn't accept their responsibility to answer a straight question? So like to say it again, if it was the case that one party and one candidate was clearly the principled godly Christian, I would have no hesitation in saying so. I tell you, and just anecdotally, a historical reference, back in England, this is what I did.
Mm-hmm.
So we were in Enfield Southgate constituency in North London. Our political candidate for the Houses of Parliament was David Burrows, who's a Christian man. I knew him personally. He went to a local evangelical church. He was the director or chairman of the his party's parliamentary Christian association.
Mm-hmm.
I encourage people to vote for him.
Yeah,
because it's like he's a principled Christian man who will answer a straight question, and his policies are trying to do Christian things.
Right.
He's the guy who opposed his own party leader's attempt to bring in so-called same-sex marriage legislatively into England. He opposed that, which is probably one of the reasons why he never made it into the cabinet.
Yeah.
And on the other side of the ticket was lack of Christian principle and basic lack of moral principle. So it wasn't a difficult call to make.
Sure.
It just is.
Yeah, and we can pray that God will raise men and women that can be that.
Right,
but in the meantime, I'd like to propose we have more important things to get about.
Husbands and wives.
Yeah, that's another argument that I've seen, unfortunately, is the exhortation for making sure husbands and wives are voting for the same person. It doesn't even have to be the presidential election. Obviously, there's local elections, there's state elections. Making sure that you're voting for the same people in every single one of those that wanted to push back against as well a little bit. God created husbands and wives to be different and complementary in a lot of ways too. But if a wife feels conscious bound to vote for one particular candidate, locally or otherwise, nationally, or over a particular issue differently than their husband should, I think the husband shouldn't compel the wife to do that.
I think it's interesting because it becomes a test case of the relationship.
Right.
So I've talked about this a good deal with people in private in the last few weeks and months.
Mm-hmm.
But I think we misconceive the relationship between husbands and wives if we view headship simply in terms of, well, I'm in charge and I get to tell you what to do. That's what authority means.
Terrible way to define marriage. Yeah.
Because now obviously headship entails authority.
Yes.
And the pattern is the pattern of Christ in the church. And Ephesians 5 is really clear. Like, let the wife see she obeys her husband, and the husbands love your wives, and wives submit to your husband. Like the text is like explicit. But I think one of the ways that we need to read this text rightly is to recognize that the analogy between Christ and the church on the one hand and husband and wife on the other does not go all the way down.
Right.
So just think of it like this, right? Christ being sinlessly perfect and as God in perfect, complete control of absolutely everything in creation still asks his bride for her opinion.
Right. And
he so orders history that he responds to what his bride says by frequently giving her what she asks for.
Right.
That's in the form of the church praying, right?
Or I want Saul. I want Saul as my king.
Right. And you think, okay, so if the sinless husband of the church will take pains to listen to his wife, the word of God repeatedly exhorts the bride to petition her husband with the expectation that the husband will have so ordered history in his sovereignty that he will grant what, to our perspective, seem like answers to our requests.
Sure.
So what's a godly Christian husband going to do? So what a godly Christian husband is going to do is realize, I'm not Jesus. I might not be seeing everything with perfect clarity.
Right.
So I've got to exercise my God-given authority over my wife, and my wife has got to submit to me as her head, but I've got to do that in a way that recognizes I don't have all the answers. And my wife, the Bible says she's given to me as a helper.
Right.
So there's got to be this two-way communion, a back and forth, a seeking of mutual understanding, so that the husband can genuinely say, yeah, I've listened to the helper my Heavenly Father has given me. I've internalized her thoughts and desires. Those thoughts and desires matter to me as keenly as my own thoughts and desires do. This is one of the ways in which Trinitarian theology bears on marriage,
Mm-hmm.
right? That the persons indwell each other.
Right.
All that is in the Son is in the Father, except sonship. All that is in the Spirit is in the Son, except spiritedness. So they are consubstantial. They're of one substance. Mm-hmm. Everything that God the Father is and cares about, the Son is and cares about, apart from fatherhood.
Sure.
So the persons mutually indwell each other. So husband and wife's relationship is supposed to mirror that most intimate of relationships. So if I'm talking to my wife and she's saying, yeah, but what about this? What about this? What about that? I've got to find a way of hearing that, feeling the weight of it, as though it were a concern that I myself had.
Right.
And then somehow bringing that together with the thoughts, such as they are, and for whatever they're worth, that I have, and coming up with a way forward that I can persuade my wife, ideally, is wise and judicious. And you can tell the marriages, over time, you can tell the marriages where this is being done and where it's not being done. Because the wives flourish in a context where it's obvious that their concerns are being heard and listened to.
Right.
And the husbands do not kind of exude this insecurity of this kind of domineering bully husband who doesn't want to listen to his wife because he doesn't want to undergo the tedious necessity of actually having to persuade her. He'd rather just tell her.
Right.
You can see the marriages that evince this. And voting is like a classic test case for this. Especially, I've got to say, especially in the current environment, where in some marriages the intuitive or instinctive emotional revulsion might be more keenly felt by either husband or wife.
Sure.
Because the issues that separate the candidates in this election and the issues that make people uncertain about what to do are not purely cognitive policy things. They're about their personality, they're about integrity, and so on and so forth.
Right.
So I want to say, for husbands and wives, when you're talking about this, please, especially if you find tension between you, let this be an opportunity for you to learn to, husbands particularly, learn to listen to your wives with the goal of feeling her questions and her concerns as keenly as you feel your own.
Right.
And processing them with her so that as one flesh you are able to move together. Ideally, I think it's great if husbands and wives vote the same.
Sure.
Because in many cases, what it could indicate is that process has gone well.
Right.
So,
husbands should be striving for those conversations and those. My wife is awesome, and I want to hear everything she has to say about all sorts of things. And the headship shouldn't be seen as a trump card to place down and command the wife to do something against their will. Because if the husband's having to do that, then obviously there's far deeper issues at play. They are not achieving what you are talking about. That that mutual indwelling is not happening, and that's a tough place to be.
I wonder if we need to talk more about that at some other point. And
indeed, we are diverting a little bit.
Yeah. All right. Well, I mean, there's a bunch of things here which we've sketched out prior to sitting down, and I think we've covered most of the bases. Are there any final thoughts that you want to throw out, Nate, before we quit?
Just a final kind of exhortation for me personally. This was something. So you mentioned before being a political science major. So I was at Patrick Henry College before transferring to New St. Andrews. I worked on a governor campaign, a congressional campaign, was very politically active, both in college and outside of it. And this is just personal experience, but I quickly saw the how it can be encouraging to see people that are godly and are making a difference. But it wasn't a healthy place to be in, to be obsessed to the extent that I was with political involvement, and understanding that I was being given areas of responsibility that were much more weighty, much more important. And as time went on, just a greater awareness that God is doing things that we wouldn't expect him to do things in the way that he does. And so it's been very refreshing for me personally to, instead of being obsessed with the things that I can't control, being more focused on the things that I can. And I'm still having difficulty doing that as it is. It's something that I have to do a better job of. Being a better husband, being a better father, being a better deacon, community member. But those are things that I can make a difference about. And at the end of the day, I can't with some of the issues of the day. And recognizing that sometimes God, he'll put in office whoever he wants. And sometimes I think the choices, we don't have to understand it or go along with it, but we can still look for a way through. Sometimes we're given the two choices, and sometimes the answer is, I'm going to send a hobbit to Mordor and have him drop a ring in a volcano. Yeah. Sometimes that's how God works, and it's glorious.
Nate Douglas, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for
God bless, and bye for now.